We're back. In our 6th episode of ARG, Not Another Podcast about book publishing with William May. We, William, Meggie, and myself, sit down and discuss exploring the journey of assembling William May's upcoming collection of poems, The Bird Wants Answers. Join us as we uncover the inspirations and challenges behind crafting his first full-length manuscript to be perhaps presented to a handful of lucky publishers.
ARG, Not Another Podcast about book publishing, hosted by William May, in which the author finds himself embroiled in a podcast about book publishing.
Hi, everyone. It's Denise here again with William May, ARG, Not Another Podcast about book publishing. And here today in the studio, we have, of course, William May. Hey, William.
Hi.
And we have Key Media Public Relations, Meggie Dimitrova, who's actually also a writer. Hi, Meggie.
Hey there.
Cool beans. Let's talk. So let's chat about, and I'm going to be probably sitting back, because Meggie, you act as the curator of the poetry of William, of which there's a wonderful abundance. And then William and I check it, but overall, your eyes are the first to see it other than William's. So share with me about what you picked, because we're currently working on a poetry book to submit to publishers, correct?
Yes. So yesterday, I sent a few poems that I've shortlisted, and in a way, when I sent you the email, you could see that I left the title for the book, The Bird Wants Answers. I don't know why I'm starting with the title, but it was something that just really, it's something that we have on the website as well. And I was thinking about this theme of like, what are the questions that we're giving answers to? So that was my whole idea about picking up these poems. So what do you think about the shortlisted poems? Do they work, or I see that they're moved around right now. So
I moved them. Yeah. I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
But William, you go first.
Well, I mean, I think to step back for a moment and talk a little bit about the project, what we're working on is trying to put together a manuscript around 100 pages of poetry. And in order to do that, we're sort of looking at the various publishers and what they're interested in. But the point is, we have all these poems, and so we're able to go in and say, okay, let's begin with almost from the backwards. So Meggie, what I would ask you is, what are some of the themes? Now, you talked about questions and wanting answers and that as an idea, and I think that's a good building place to start with. I think one thing to think about is how we can break it into sort of different parts. So if we have 5 sub-themes, then each one of those becomes easier to fill in, because we go, okay, we need 20 poems that fit this sub-theme. And once we have each of those, we can decide how we're going to assemble it into a larger piece.
Yeah, that's great. Kind of breaking it down.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of that is stuff that Meggie was talking about. There are certain methods when you're looking on an individual level at different poems and you're saying, okay, how do these poems fit together? Also, I'm not very precious about a lot of the work. So because of the fact that I write so much and I have so many poems, I don't feel necessarily like an egotistical attachment to the poem being exactly how I put it. Also, revision is a process, and you learn more and more that you have to be open to change. So one thing that I'm aware of is that as we're working on this book, the poems are probably going to change a little bit individually to fit together. So, for example, a lot of the poems right now are like one long stanza. But it's very easy to say, oh, we can break these stanzas and make, something that has a certain shape or a certain form, and that form reflects another poem, so that we get matching pieces that fit together. And also, like, language-wise, we can play with little bits of language and say, okay, we want this to be a theme, and so let's find a way to weave little bits of language that are like this through the book. Yeah. And that's something that happens as we're building. So right now we're at this beginning point. We have about 4 poems, right?
Yeah.
Let's start looking at them, I guess. I think, or Denise.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Go on. So my question is, because when I read the 4, there were 2 themes that hit me right away, not knowing that Meggie's initial idea was answers, which I think is very cool. And then I love the idea of breaking it down. But what I read was, and that's why I put the first one at top, I read animals, because there seemed to be a theme of animals, with the bell of the cow, and then also with the
unicorn,
unicorn, which is sort of an animal. And then with the bird, and then I also felt history. And I thought that was interesting, history from poetry. I mean, obviously there are probably poems that have been written about all types of happenings in our country and the world, but doing it subtly is kind of interesting. So that was my thought. But, and that's why I put the first one first, because I thought it was so magical. I loved it. I love the unicorn. I think that it's a metaphor for many things, William. So I love that poem.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so do you want to go over the poems now, or do we want to?
Sure. I mean, I was going to say that I do have a lot more animal poems if we want to go in that direction. I mean, that's something that
could be. I think that because anyways, we need more than 100 pages. So I would say that could be potentially a theme to kind of fill in.
Sure.
My initial thought was, okay, answers. And I also, while I was putting them together, subconsciously, I chose the ones that were for animals. So I'm happy that Denise noticed that.
Ha, cool. You can't fool me, Meggie Dimitrova.
No.
Unfoolable.
I do have a lot more poems with animals. One thing, usually the animal is a central character, or given a kind of anthropomorphic role. They're the figure in the center of whatever's being discussed. Because it's not necessarily formed into a narrative story in that way. It's sometimes just a situation.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. And also living creatures. They're the other living creatures that we can somehow, some way relate to on this earth. Other things are living, but
I mean, I'm often using them as stand-ins for people. So I think there's a number of textures we can look at as working, even if we keep animal as central.
So here's my question, because I think I like the idea of answers and then animals. So answers and animals. And so is it possible? I don't know all your animal poetry, but if we focus on animals and then within the animal category, if we do somehow find the poems that may inspire answers, that may maybe even ask more questions, I don't know. But I like the concept of putting animals in different scenarios, or having that as subtitles, to go with the answers. Or we omit the answers and just do animals. It's up to you guys. It's up to you, William, really.
Well, I mean, I don't know. First of all, these are themes for us. We don't necessarily have to put them in something when we're saying, oh, this is what this book is to the world. So I don't have a problem with the idea of, okay, we're looking for things that are about questions and answers. I think that's also a fairly universal reality of any kind of writing. I mean, I don't think I'm going to sit down to write something without it being like, oh, well, what am I thinking about? What is it that's, you know, that's gnawing at me that I'm trying to get through, that I'm trying to answer something about? I think that's kind of where most writing comes from, or most creation has come from.
Seeking and searching. Yeah,
Well, yeah,
I hear
and
you.
answering something.
Yeah.
Right,
I mean, I
right.
think there's always some sort of question. You know, I think that that's something that we can fairly easily say, okay, let's look at this. And, you know, it's more a question of drawing out that theme through the work that we put it together with.
Got it. And
It's
so
not
okay,
necessarily.
right, I got it. But when Maggie's going to be curating and looking at the poetry, her idea, and I do think that sometimes animals can help us to find answers, and so obviously, not to get too scientific, but they are used often to find health. You know, like as I know when I went to high school, cadavers, frogs. You know, we always used an animal, which I really disdained it. I mean, it was something I didn't like at all. But animals have been very much in the path of humans for research. And so that's another concept, but that's a separate thing. But it is still finding answers. Animals have been helping us to find answers, maybe now with a lot less cruelty. So, yeah, so I think it's cool. I think answers in animals. So what's the next step? In your thinking, Meggie, what should we do with the rest of our time on this Zoom in our meeting? Should we go over what we have, or should we let William point us in the right direction of where they might be, or should he put his animal poems all together, and then you can go through them to see if they answer animals, if that comes together?
Okay, so I would say let's go through the poems and see if we're even on the right direction. Like, I mean, does it make sense? So let's go through we have 4 poems. Let's go through them. You move them around. I mean, I'm okay with that.
I think it'd be important for William to point you in the direction of his animal poetry, because then you don't spend
I'm working on that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let me just say this one thing. William, are you going to read the poetry, or do we want to who wants to read them? You want to read them, or how are we going to go over them?
I mean, I don't know. I think it may make sense for somebody else to read them just so we can hear them. Because if I read it, I'm going to read it the way I intend it to be read. And that's not necessarily what's on the page.
Okay, so Meggie, are you cool if Meggie and I can read them? So I'll read the first one, you read the next one. And yes, and let's use the order starting off with the unicorn, because I put that first.
I mean, I want to point out, I don't think right now the order is really important. I think it's more a matter of because whatever order it winds up in is going to be totally unrelated to this at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So where the unicorns are. In the telling I have heard, the unicorns missed the ark, drowned in that great flood, disappeared from the surface of the earth due to the lack of a representative couple on board. Has no one thought, though, that such creatures as unicorns are not governed by the rules we know? Such wise, mystical beasts would not be cowed even by such a flood. No, they did not fear the flood, for they knew within them the power of transformation. Learned to love the water so they have never returned from becoming the narwhal. William, what does narwhal mean? I love the word.
It's a type of dolphin, or it's a fish. But it's a sea creature that has a horn. Although technically it's a tooth, but...
Okay, didn't know about it.
I mean, I don't think that I'm the first person to play with this, to be honest. But I came up with it independently, and then I found out afterwards that other people had written similar kinds of themes. But I don't think that matters. Okay, so the theme, just so I know real quick. So the theme would be, because this in a way answers questions. In other words, why were no unicorns represented? And I like the idea that could be a question, but also my question to you is, what are unicorns actually representing to you in this poem? I mean, I think this poem exists in a context. For example, there's the Shel Silverstein poem song about unicorns during the flood, and they drown at the end because they like are just too busy playing, something like that, and don't get on the flood. Like, or Noah forgets about them. I forget the whole story, but there's a Shel Silverstein poem that became a song it's played very commonly on like St. Patrick's Day. So
that's random. Why on real quick? Why on St. Patrick's Day? So unicorns
because
Irish?
It's well, I think the version of it that was recorded by an Irish band. And I think it may be like a fairly Irish sounding song. I'll find the name of it for you. It's called The Unicorn, and it's by Shel Silverstein. The original version of it from the 60s that became a hit was done by the Irish Rovers.
That's why. Okay, there's a connection.
So
they were a band of leprechauns, of course.
Well, kind of. I guess. I don't know. I don't know. That may be a problematic statement in this era. I don't know.
Okay,
but anyway.
Wait. No,
the point is, part of this for me, in terms of the unicorns, though, is also there's a playing here with like logical questions in the face of myth. There's something about this idea of like thinking about the magical and mythical, but in a way that's much more aligned with like, oh, well, like let's think about like what's real and how the world works. And about the idea of like, okay, well, like the question of like, where were the unicorns when Noah was putting animals on the ark is kind of an absurd question to begin with.
Yes.
Because you're starting in a mythical place and you're kind of starting in two separate mythical places that don't necessarily coexist. Not that there is a problem with them coexisting, but that they just aren't together in an inherent way. So there's something a little bit silly about that as a starting point. And I think there's something about taking all of that seriously that I think is a lot of what this poem is playing with.
I think it's interesting because you've mentioned St. Patrick's Day, and funnily enough, the next poem is called A Sobering Reminder, and it talks about I'm going to read it because it's a very short poem.
Sure.
St. Patrick's Day, it's all about, I mean, in a way, it is about drinking, right? At least around Europe, we have a lot of people just gather around to take usually
New York too.
Beer.
Definitely New York. A lot of Irish beers, green and all that stuff.
Green hat. They just all sing on the streets, and it's Irish pubs. So that's my, at least when I hear about St. Patrick's Day, that's what appears in my mind. That's how the next poem goes. A sobering reminder. Is it worth considering that our forefathers, the men who built this nation, who fought the war of the independence, who crafted the principles of our governance, those men were all drunks, at least by modern standards? What else would you call someone who drinks more beer than water, even at breakfast? So that's the next poem.
Oh, that's interesting how they're connecting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, that's very cool. In fact, yeah. And that's probably why I put the two of them together, though I didn't get the connection with the leprechauns and the drinking and the Irish and the unicorns. Though it's very similar, like the mystical, I mean, if you think about it, the mystical creatures, unicorns, leprechauns.
George Washington. What? He is a mythical figure at this point.
No, he did definitely existed because they have his. Don't they have his?
Yeah, sure, but he's been a myth longer than he was ever alive. I mean, the story of George Washington is more a thing than anything he actually did.
We could see it like this. Yeah, that's funny.
I mean,
that's it.
I'm not saying he wasn't a real person too, but
Yeah. Cool. Okay, cool.
I mean, I don't know that I necessarily would put those poems together expecting people to get that connection, but I do find it interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I didn't
That's also
catch
the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier, where it's not necessarily what's in the poem inherently. It's what comes out of the poem in the context.
Yeah.
Right. And exactly. It's like it's almost themes approach themselves. In other words, approaching themes approach themselves, because this was just a nonchalant, I reordered it and there they are. There is a kind of a bond or a theme. And so sure. Like you said, and it has a lot to do with the words. And when a reader, I was reading them, and for some reason, that's the order I put them in because of the words that I was reading. And so it's the author that leads us to the approach and to the themes, whether we tell them that's the theme or not. And so in poetry, and I'm going to ask a question just because I don't know the answer, back to answers, like, William, is that part of poetry? Do people share when they release a book of poetry that the themes are such, or do they share what they want the audience to read, or do they just release it? Because poetry is real quick.
For the most part, I don't think poets necessarily in any formal way do that. There are certainly books that I can point to where a poet will give like an introduction or something of that sort. Though that's less common these days. I mean, William Carlos Williams wrote this beautiful essay introducing his book, The Wedge. And it's amazing. It begins with the statement, the Wedge came out in the late, or at some point in the 40s, and it was concurrent with World War II. And he writes this essay and he says, everything is the war today. This book is the war too, just another front. And that's how he begins this essay introducing the book.
So we know right away that this book was not an easy task for him, correct?
Well, and not only that, but that he's viewing it as connected to the world in the moment. That everything he's writing is the news.
Got it.
You know what I mean?
So it's not history. It's not about George Washington. Right. It's about right there. It's about the moment, more about being in the moment. And I have a real quick thought for you. I want to share with you, William, because this is my impression of poetry. Of course, we're all three of us are from different decades, born different times. But for me, I always think of poets, all poets, as sort of like the Bob Dylans of songwriters. In other words, Bob Dylan had this very much, he didn't like to be approached. He was very, like Greta Garbo, like certain people have this, they don't want to be commercialized to a certain extent. And so like you wouldn't see Bob Dylan driving in a car and saying, I love my car, because he's never been commercial. He's never been that kind of an artist. And I always think of poets as far as in the writer genre as being kind of that way. They don't care if you see them. They don't care if you know too much about what they had for breakfast or dinner. They're kind of a little bit more aloof. They're a little bit more mysterious, like a unicorn or a leprechaun. And so is that kind of the essence of poets, or is that how it was?
I mean, I think you get into trouble trying to give poets a personality. Like, seriously, I've met people who are poets who come from all sorts of different backgrounds. I've met people who are neurosurgeons.
Oh, wow.
Who are poets. I've met people who were in the military. And there's a story years ago, one of my poetry professors told this story about he was on a military base and he gets a tap on the shoulder from someone and they're like, you have to come with me. And they take him down to this office and they say to him, whoever it is wants to see you. And he's like, oh shit. Because he's like the head of the base. And he walks into this room and he's the head of the entire facility is sitting there. And he looks at him and says, close the door behind you. And he closes the door and he says, sit down. And he sits him down and he says, I need you to swear to secrecy on this, but I write poetry. Seriously, like, because this was a very heavy hitter military guy who was afraid that if people learned he wrote poetry, they would think less of him.
They wouldn't
That's
take him
interesting.
seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so.
That's weird.
I mean,
because
this is 20 years ago, but
So this is your professor who was in the military for a while.
no, he
Somewhere
was just
on the base. He was
he
on
was
the base.
on the base. He'd been invited to give a reading or something,
Got it.
whatever it was.
And what was your
You know.
professor's response? What was your professor's response when
He looked at some of the guy's poetry and gave him some comments. He said, he wrote poetry. It wasn't great. He said he wasn't,
Wow.
an
And he never
amazing
told.
discovery, but
he
he was
never
writing
told us.
poetry.
Right? He never told a soul except he told the story.
I mean, look, by the time he
Without a
told me
name.
the story, the guy may have been retired. He certainly didn't give me a name.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So poets,
Yeah, so-
which is to my point. Poets are more anonymous, which is exactly
I don't
where
know
I
that
started.
that's necessarily true.
Back when
I think
I get it.
Poetry as an art is something that I think anyone could approach. I don't think that it's something that requires a certain disposition or a certain attitude in terms of oh, you have to be this type of person. You have to see the world in a certain way. I do think that the practice of poetry will change you and make you more aware and observant in specific ways over time. And that it can also, Coleman Barks, the poet who translates Rumi, very famously. That's his big thing that he's known for. So, whenever you've seen one of these books of Rumi love poetry and stuff, it's probably a Coleman Barks translation.
Can you explain real quick what Rumi is to the listeners? Real quick.
Rumi is a Sufi mystical poet who he's become somewhat popular in the last 30 years, probably. And a lot of that is because of Coleman Barks.
Coleman Barks. And what century is Rumi from?
You know what? Honestly, I have to look that up. 1273 is when he died.
Right. 1273.
So,
Wow.
Yes. So he was
Okay.
a 13th century Islamic scholar, Sufi mystic, poet. And
Interesting.
his
Okay.
poetry is very much in that tradition. It's very much written from that perspective. But Coleman Barks talked about how the practice of translating and reading Rumi and being that close with the work has changed him, has taught him things, has made him more aware of the world in certain ways that he wasn't before. And I think that's true of any poetic practice.
Right. Okay. But my question is this then. So if a person writes poetry, is that the soul that will be shifted, or is it also those that read it? Both. The reader and the writer?
Well, I mean, I think so. I think it's more.
I think it's two different things, no? Because I would say what you shared about the translator, the work of Rumi is so profound in a way, and it's so philosophical and deep, and it takes a lot of depth to understand the words in order to translate them and to go through them. And you also need to, you almost need to experience what he experienced in order to be able to translate it. And I also believe I've spoken about this with, I don't know, William, if you agree with this, but the translation is another form of art. It's still a translation from the original, but it's on its own, it's another form of art. So, yeah.
I mean, in translation, there are so many different approaches. And I think that there are ways in which some translators who are purely scholarly and trying to just capture a academic meaning, that's not necessarily true. But
No,
I
I'm
think for
talking
somebody
about
like Coleman
fiction.
Barks,
Yeah, fiction or poem or poetry.
Well, I mean-
Yeah.
there are people who will translate those things in the way I'm talking about. But for someone like Coleman Barks, he's trying to create something that gives an experience for the reader in a way that, reflects the original work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I do agree with you. I would say that, though, that there is, I think that having an intimate relationship with poetry, whether as a writer or as a reader, can have a profound meaning in a life.
That's beautiful. And I tend to agree with you. Just real quick, when I first started writing songs, I was living in Princeton, New Jersey. And I remember I met a few people. One particular guy, I can't remember his name. He was tall, he was blonde. I remember his face right now, but not his name. And he gave me a book of poetry. And then another professor from Berkeley I met in the park, he gave me a book of Walt Whitman poetry. For some reason, when I told people I was working on, I'm a songwriter, I'm teaching myself how to write songs, people always gave me poetry books as a gift to help me along the way. And they definitely helped me along the way. So poetry has a deep meaning for me in my life. And not that I've ever gotten into any particular writer, but I remember the moments when people, suggested reading poetry to work on the rhythms and the feeling of songwriting, which they're similar because you have to me, in a way, a songwriting, the lyrics, and
question?
poetry. Sure.
What do you remember the names of the books? Like,
Well, if
I
it
have
was
the
Whitman,
book.
it was Leaves of Grass.
Exactly. And he actually
just
wrote
with
and signed in
addition.
it. I was actually in Washington Square Park, William, and and he was of Indian descent. And he was teaching, he's a teacher at Berkeley, but he was doing something at NYU, and he gave me this book. I still have the book, and he signed it and wished me good luck on my journey with songwriting. So it's interesting how I think you're absolutely right. Profound difference in one's life, poetry. And that really is a beautiful, beautiful way to possibly take this podcast and sort of think about wrapping it up and what's next for us, because I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. At least I think so. And I'm not sure what else. We have other poems to read. How many more poems?
Yeah, there are a couple more poems in
more.
here.
We have two more. The Bird Wants Answers, and we have Holy Cow.
So why don't I read Holy Cow and then you read the longer one, The Bird Wants Answers. And again, it's on William's website, The Bird Wants Answers. That's the title of for some reason, I think when we were building the website, we agreed that was going to be a great
Tagline.
theme, great title. Yeah. So it's interesting. And I think that's a great idea in a way to make that the first title of the first poetry book. Okay, Holy Cow. Holy cow. Mr. Hickman is never clear on the facts of just how his prize-winning heifer, Lulu Bell, came to be so blessed. Always tells a different story. He said once it was when he let an old crone stay in his farmhouse overnight. Turned out she was the fairy princess, rewarded him by blessing Lulu Bell. Another time, he'd won the sacred beast in a poker game against a mysterious foreigner. Then again, he said Lulu Bell was blessed by Saint Assisi. However it happened, though, Lulu Bell is something special. Her milk is true magic. I've seen it heal wounds, turn the old back to their youth. I drank some once myself, not even feeling ill, young enough already at the time. So it turned me up until I was strong as Superman. Just couldn't fly. Mr. Hickman noticed, though, that Lulu Bell was aging. Not as much milk coming out any longer. So he made her drink her own milk, which did the trick and restored her. Once wasn't enough, of course, and he had to keep making her drink that magic elixir of her own making just to keep her able to make it. Now the only drinks it is Lulu Bell. She can't make more than she can need. Tell me about that line, William. And now the only one drinks it is Lulu Bell. Is that proper? I mean, is there a word missing?
No,
It should
there's
be-
no word, man. It's just, I mean, we can think about the construction if you think it's a little awkward, but
I think the word who might work. And now the only one whom or who drinks it is Lulu Bell.
I'm looking at it. I think I might have.
That's better. Yeah. And now the only one drinking it is Lulu Bell. Cool. Thank you. Right on. Okay, Meg, it's up to you. And I think this also fits in perfectly. This, by the way, all these together are beautiful with what we're talking about.
I feel like this one and the first one, so the one with the unicorn and this one, for me, appear somehow mystical. So there is something about, this is something mysterious, something mystical. So that's probably one of my reasons to kind of put them together.
Right. So Holy Cow and the unicorn poem. Right. Yeah. I got that when I was reading it the second time. I didn't catch the connection the first time. But this time when I was actually reading it, I go, oh, Meg. And I was actually thinking this while I was reading. Maggie's so clever. You're so clever.
I think I don't know if it's about being clever. I think I always read William's poems out loud, including my own. Like when I write
that's
a poem,
interesting.
I always read them out loud in order to hear how they sound.
That's awesome.
Kind of like imagine, okay, yeah, that's for me, it's really important, and that's why I love when we used to do the. And by the way, the Bird Wants Answers, like everyone can find it both on the website and on the social media because we have it recited several times. And we did recite, William recited excerpts from the poem, so it can be found recited as well and on the YouTube channel. But this one, like, it sounds so beautiful. Yeah, that's okay. I usually, when I pick up, because I remember William asked, how did I pick them up? Like, I usually read them out loud.
That's a great thing to share. Thanks for sharing that. And I have to say, this is like the confessions of a poet in a way.
Well, I mean, it's funny to me that you're so astonished because reading out loud is kind of just what you do with poetry.
Yeah.
Well, I know that, but
I don't mean it like that. I just mean, like, for me, as someone who has lived with poetry in my life as a daily part of it for decades, that's just like, it's like automatically I think, okay, you're reading a poem, you're going to read it out loud. At least I'm not insane enough to walk down the street reading it out loud while I'm walking on my own or something, but
when you're at home or in a city.
I get it.
Yeah.
But let me share my perspective real quick, then Maggie will grace us with her reading of The Bird Wants Answers. But my feeling is, and I'm not the world's most avid reader. I do like short stories. I do like articles and poetry. But for me, reading is silent. That's just my own personal experience with reading. As in, it's something that whatever sounds are around you, typically I don't like to have other things on, like music or anything else, but nature sounds are sometimes there, or, street sounds. But it's also, for me, I'm an audio kind of person because of music and recording and talking and, a very, very visceral kind of person. So reading to me is when you kind of close yourself off from the rest of the world and there's silence. And you kind of experience something in a very different way when you read. So that's my 2 cents. I
think that's true, but I think it's worth noting that poetry is an oral art, AU oral, not O.
Yeah.
But that's the root of a lot of the musicality and the metrics. They're built in the fact that it's something you're going to hear.
Yeah, no, I get it. And makes sense. I just never connected the two, but that's right. Beautiful. And I actually now I'm going to read all the poems out loud. And again, as I said, when I first read these earlier this morning before our call, they meant something different, or I had a different feel, but reading them out loud, especially Holy Cow, I had a whole different experience with it. Cool.
I'm curious,
Maggie?
what was it that changed for you in hearing?
Yeah, I was about to ask the same.
Okay. Okay, this is going to sound really kind of a little silly. My own voice saying some of the words. So I put myself into it more. So, because I'm an audio kind of gal. So
Right.
when I said the word mysterious foreigner, it's like, ooh, and also just again, after our discussion, after we talked about the theme and we talked about the unicorn, we talked magical, I think I was in tune. My senses were a little bit more in tune to leprechauns and unicorns and all of the stuff that goes with it. So, yeah. But I think hearing my voice read it, it was a double experience for me, reading it, and then speaking it. Magic elixir. And I don't think I actually picked up the magical part of the story until I read it out loud.
That's beautiful.
William, what do you think?
No, I think one thing for me is that like the language in this is doing a lot of work. There's a lot of play, and I feel like it's a fairly dense piece in terms of the language. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of that feeling doesn't come through when you don't hear it.
Right. Well, milk is dense, so it's kind of interesting thinking about it.
Right, but I mean,
ask you a
like
question?
if you look at like even just like a few lines. Another time he'd won the sacred beast in a poker game against a mysterious foreigner. Then again, he said Lulu Bell was blessed by Saint Assisi.
Yeah,
now, if you just listen to that, there's like sort of a rhyme quality to it. That it's not quite rhymey, but it's I don't know how to explain it, but there's something.
There's a meter. It's got a meter.
meter.
It's a meter. Yeah, exactly. But I have to ask you a question now, William, and then we got to get back to Meggie reading the final poem. So, William, do you read your poems out loud as you write them or when they're done, or is it what you do last to say this is done?
Oh, I'm definitely reading out loud throughout the process.
Okay.
But I also am at the point where I've been doing this, I hear it in my head very, very clearly. So like even when I'm not reading it out loud, I'm kind of reading it out loud.
So it's your voice almost reciting in your own mind and telling you the word.
I've learned to do that because that's how I have to hear it.
Yeah, that's how I do the songwriting. I hear things in my head.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because it was if you hear the difference between how Denise, when you read out the poem, and then right now when William read out these few lines, it
night and day.
Sounds so no, it sounds just completely different, and it's the same poem, and it's just completely different reading. And I, for example, when right now I will try to read the bird one's answers. For me, as someone who's not a native speaker, my native language is Cyrillic. So our rhythm of like when we are reading out poetry is different. And nowadays I speak Portuguese as well and some Spanish. And like all of these languages, they all sound different in my mind, in my head, right? And I do write most of my poetry. I write in English, but it sounds, I think it's the English that kind of, it's a broken English in a way. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but it's just my own understanding of English because it's not the native one, right? And I just find this very fascinating how our own, persona, our own character, our own personality affects the way how we read something and the way how we read out loud. And I find this really, really fascinating.
So now why don't you charm us with your reading of the final poem? Unless, William, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
No, all I was going to say is that, for one thing, that was partly why I think it's important for this as an exercise for you guys to read the poems as opposed to me, because I'll read it, as I said, exactly in a way that's like, this is how I hear it.
Yeah,
and
this
it's
is
not
great.
necessarily on the page.
And
you were spot on.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have different readers that are going to read your poems. So like they will put their own voice and they will put their own understanding into like the poems and your work.
Yeah, it's like the same. It's almost like we could do this as a podcast, the same poem 3 times. So we could actually do another podcast where we pick 4 poems and all 3 of us read it. And bottom line is, even if I hear the way, and I heard the way William read it, I would not read it that way. That's not how I would read it.
No, and I don't think that's the point.
Yeah, no, exactly.
No, it's not.
So William, are we cool to have her read it, and then we'll close?
I was going to say one little thing about language, which is that, like, when I was studying, like in grad school, one of the conversations we had was about how English is built around or naturally falls into iambic pentameter or iambic with the sentences tend towards 10-ish syllables in spoken language. So this is something that, like, if you were to record the common conversations around you, you would find that most of them are metrical, or at least roughly. And that's different in different languages. So I think Polish, it uses the opposite, which is the dactyl, I think. It's been many years since I've used these terms. But there's stress on stress, and there's unstressed stress. And some languages use one, and some as the common meter, and some use the other. So I was sort of like, I find that interesting. I don't know specifically where every language falls, but that's something that I think with what Meggie was talking about, I think that's what comes into my mind is that metrical quality that every language contains.
If you try to imagine Bulgarian, it's really close to Russian because it's a Cyrillic language, and if you see it written down, it would look. I understand a lot of Russian because of my language. And we run a writing workshop here in Porto, and there is one Russian lady who writes poetry, and she was trying to translate it like literally in English, and she said I couldn't find the right words. I wanted to rhyme it, I wanted it to sound similar, I wanted it to sound the same, and it can't. It needs to be a different poem, like it needs to be something completely different.
Well, I mean, like
that, yeah.
Japanese haiku. It kind of drives me mad when people talk about it being like a certain number of syllables and this, that, and the other, because those concepts are not in Japanese.
Yeah.
The Japanese language doesn't break words into syllables the same way that we do in English because it's pictographic.
Yeah.
So it has a very different set of parameters that don't work in English. But you want to read that?
Yeah, I'm going to read the last one. It's called The Bird Wants Answers, and in case, once again, you want to hear William read it, go to the website, the social media, or YouTube.
We can post a link in the description for the podcast.
Yeah, I would do that. The bird wants answers. He was gentle, but still, bird beaks are sharp and hard, and I didn't know if he was aiming to eat me whole and live. Last night, a giant bird came, ripped the roof off my house, took me from bed while my wife was still slept. The flight he took must have been all night long. When we landed, there was the beginning of dawn lighting our surroundings. He placed me down upon soft grass, let me rise again to my feet as he regarded me in the dark wetness of his left eye. He spoke, sudden and sharp. "How are you?" he asked. "I have been better, honestly." He did not reply, but turned his head to stare at me from the right. "How are you?" he asked again. I looked at him. He was only a bird repeating what he had heard someone say. So it has been now for how long? I don't know my way home, cannot say how far we flew to come here or how many days ago. He loves to speak, though only the one phrase says it to me so much, wishes me to always answer. That is why he told me not to eat my body, but instead to talk with, to ease the loneliness of unanswered questions.
Okay, so I think this is a good place to wrap up. I want to ask William, anything else that you want to bring into the conversation for today?
I mean, I think we're good. I think the sort of idea of looking around for more animal stuff to kind of pull in for now makes sense.
Great.
The only thing I wanted to add was themes. I would say a few. So one of them, animals, answering questions or like answering. And there was also the mystical part.
Okay.
These three.
I think we agree on that. That's fantastic. This has been fun. This is interesting. This we can do more of these. That's what I think. What do you guys think? More of these types of conversations?
Yes. So like as we are building the manuscript, I think it's going to be
it's interesting.
An interesting process to kind of follow through and
So let's do it next week too. But I also want to say that I think William, you have so many stories. It's fascinating. You know, I love listening to your stories. Okay, cool. So for now, we're going to sign off. Au revoir.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Be well. This is William May saying goodbye. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends. If not, please share it with your enemies.
ARG, Not Another Podcast About Book Publishing, is produced by Denise Marsa, Meggie Dimitrova, and William May. Please visit williammaywrites.com for social media links, recited poems, and more.